Building a QuickBooks-style database for music using Microsoft Excel. This time constructing a music input by single unit of time data input sheet. So get ready and some coffee because we're about to excel at automating Excel. Here we are in Excel. If you don't have access to this workbook, that's okay because we basically built this from a blank worksheet but started in a prior presentation. So if you want to build this entire worksheet from a blank sheet, you could begin back there or just follow along, possibly building the part of the table that we're currently working on. If you do have access to this workbook though, 4 tabs down below. Example, accounting practice blank. Example, in essence, the answer key, the end result. Accounting tab, having the analogous accounting system we will be comparing and contrasting to. Practice tab has pre-formatted cells, so you could practice the practice problem with less Excel formatting, but if you don't have any of that, that is okay because we'll continue to work in the blank tab where we started with a blank worksheet, continuing in essence in the blank part of the worksheet, practicing not only our table construction, but Excel formatting as well for formatting's sake. So in a prior presentation, we've been comparing and contrasting the building of our table to an accounting system over here, where the general idea from an accounting system is the data input is directional, going from the chart of accounts to the general ledger to the journal that will then be used to construct a trial balance. And then that trial balance is used typically to construct the financial statements, remembering that a database is a little bit different, possibly pulling more often from just one source of data. But so those are two ways to visualize them. They both have their pros and cons. However, in the music system, we could visualize it going either way a little bit more easily, which will be demonstrated at this point in the project. Up until this point, we had the analogous system of the accounts in an accounting system being the letters in our alphabet of musical alphabet. The account numbers were equivalent to our numbering system. Then we also have this background of the MIDI notes encoding both of those two things together, a little bit different in our accounting system and our music system for that. And then we added this engine, which is a relative perspective engine, which closely or most analogous represents kind of like the closing process. So now let's go to the example tab and think of the next thing that we're going to do. I want to build a table like this, which will be similar to the general ledger in an accounting system, which we can then see would be combined together to create the end result similar to a trial balance in music, that being like the MIDI roll system. In other words, we could think about the MIDI roll as basically the trial balance, in that it has on the x-axis time on the x-axis, and then on the y-axis it has the accounts or the numbers, and then in our musical alphabet, which could be numbered, and then we could also apply this relative perspective. Now, note that when you do the data input into a music system, you usually just do it in the MIDI roll, or you want to see it all at once so you can see the pattern as the music progresses over time. However, and then within each of those timestamps, you can imagine drilling down to get to the source data, which might look something like this so that you can get a more detailed perspective of one particular unit in time. So, but you can also imagine it being constructed in reverse, similar to a counting system, where each unit of time would be constructed as a general ledger comparison that would then be compiled into the end result, the MIDI roll equivalent to the trial balance. In other words, let's take a look at our QuickBooks system over here and say, if I go to the first tab, the data input is here. So these are the forms that create our journal entry. The forms then create the general ledger, which is typically used to create the trial balance. The trial balance is kind of like the end report that everything else we think of as being built from. Notice in QuickBooks that we don't really see that middle step, and even if we were to see the middle step, QuickBooks might kind of, as a database, pull all the information from the source documents or the source material that forms the journal entries instead of in our linear progression. But it's easy to visualize it going in that progression. In other words, if I drill down on the checking account, I get to something that is similar, transaction report, to a general ledger. If I go over here to my accounting system this way, usually I think of it as the journal entry, forms, making journal entries, create the general ledger, similar to the transaction report, that creates the trial balance. But in QuickBooks, usually we're thinking we do the data input, it creates the forms, which you could kind of think of as the trial balance, and then I drill back down on the general ledger, which is the data input, which means that the QuickBooks system is almost bi-directional as in similar way as the music system kind of is. So our analogy to the music system would be this in report is the trial balance, and then basically that would be like the MIDI roll system. And then what we're going to do is drill down on the trial balance to get to one particular point, or the information that was used to build this. In terms of MIDI roll, that represents a time. There's a time component in the MIDI. Whereas in here, everything is grouped together. All the time is kind of grouped together. And when I look at the time, this is actually expanding the time component, right? Because this is giving the information in that account over a period of time. Okay, so I know that's a little bit loose of an analogy. We'll close the gap on that at the capstone project to kind of see how we can make both of these systems a little more bi-directional, or convert them or reconcile them both. But that's kind of the idea. So what I'm going to do now, instead of building the MIDI roll, we're going to pretend, or we're going to imagine building it one by one, time unit by time unit. So instead of looking at the time units themselves in a MIDI roll, which is a little bit overwhelming, you could imagine someone building a song very detailed, in which case they're going to enter 1 unit of time at a time, and then compile them into a series of units over time, beats over time. Why would you do that? Because then you can really kind of rotate the two knobs of rotation, modal center and collection of notes, to really analyze each thing that you're constructing and rotate it around more specifically. If you converted this to an instrument like a guitar, then this could also give you an output, meaning for each unit of time, that would be like a chord that's going to be displayed on some kind of instrument that would be mapped out on possibly a fretboard, which had x-axis on half steps. Y-axis is circle of fourths and fifths. Again, we'll talk about that like a lot later, but it's the same principle in that each timestamp in the MIDI roll should be able to be broke down into a more detailed unit to analyze it better, possibly with just this format, 12 along the x-axis, octaves on the y-axis, or an actual instrument, which could be based off of the grid, half steps on the x-axis, circle of fourths, fifths on the y, then condensed down to the specifics of a particular instrument based off that grid. We'll talk about that later. All right, so I'm going to go back on over here, and I'm going to imagine then simply building a grid that's going to have just 12 units on the x-axis. Let's grab this skinny, Home tab, clipboard, Format Paint. We'll put that on column K. And then I'm going to start this off by saying that let's first build the two modes, the two knobs that we're going to use to rotate the collection. I'm going to call that a modal knob, let's say, and it has it's going to be the modal knob. Let's just keep it there for now. I'll make that black and white. And then I'm going to put that here, and let's say we're going to say the mode is going to be just 1 to start off with, meaning I'm going to look at it from the perspective of the Ionian to start off with. And then I can rotate it through each of the perspectives by going up through these mode numbers, but usually I'm not going to be looking at it from the perspective of 1.5, right? I'm only going to use the non 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, or 7, Ionian through Locrian. That's one way that we can take all of our music and basically rotate it around from different perspectives. So then the second one is going to be the collection. The collection. And so I'll make that, let's make this a little larger now. I have to make it, I just made it small, now I'll make it larger. I'll make that black and white. And the collection, I'm going to name the collection by the numbers of the notes, which there are 1 through 12. So I'm going to start using a clock terminology to name the collection, and that's going to be 1 through 12 o'clock. So in other words, if I say something is 4, then I'm going to say it's at 4 o'clock, meaning the collection of notes that is around the key of C major, always looking from the perspective of the Ionian. So when I name the collection, I'm always going to be naming it from the perspective of the Ionian. Why? Because that's just tradition. So if I say it's 4 o'clock, 4 is a C, 1 is A. If absolute note numbers, 1 is A, 2 is A sharp, B flat, 3 is B, 4 is C, 5 is C sharp, D flat, and so on. And then I can change the tonic, which is going to be here, the mode that we're going to be playing in. So right, which will be the center, right? And so in this case, Ionian. So if I said something like we're playing at 6 o'clock and then 2, that means 6 o'clock from the perspective of the Ionian would be D major collection. So, and then the 2 is, and then the 2 is going to mean that we're on the Dorian point. So we're looking at the Dorian as the tonic in essence. Okay, so for right now, I'm going to also say that I want this collection to be reflected here in my engine. So now if this collection is 6, I want this to change to 6. So I'm going to say this is dependent on that 6 right there. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to show that this is a nodal point by making it like yellow. This is the data input field. I'm going to select the drop down, have more colors, and I'm going to make that in the standard wheel. I'm going to make it like a brighter blue. So that's the key for the rotation, and so will this be. So this thing will change this, meaning if I'm at 4 o'clock, the note numbers will change, which will also change the letters, but this will remain the same. That gives me my relative position. So if I say this is 6 o'clock, now I've changed this. Now the Ionian is D. All right. Now I could still say that the tonic is down here. The Dorian is the tonic, right? But I'm looking at the collection based on the Ionian node. So 6 o'clock Ionian, Dorian, tonic is what I'm kind of trying to indicate there. All right, let's bring it back to the standard of 4 o'clock and then Ionian's perspective. Okay, so that's going to be the general layout. Now let's map out up top. Let's make another skinny. I'll put a format painter to the N, and then I'm going to make this 4, and then this is going to be this plus 1. So I'm going to make 12 units. So this is 1, 2. I'm going to copy this over. 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. I lost it. But let's make this. What if this was like 1? Then this would go out to 10, 11, 12. All of these are dependent on the cell before it. Okay, so then I'm going to make this skinny. Going to select all these, double click up top, making them skinnier. I'll make them a little wider than that. All right, there's our table up top. Now we have the top row, which is going to be 12 units across. This is going to be our note numbers. And then below it, we're going to be putting our note letters, which I could do with an XLOOKUP table comparing the numbers and the letters. And then the next row is going to be 12 units across. And this is going to be the modal center. And this is going to be the one that drives kind of the engine of where our starting point is going to be. So this is going to be equal to the mode up top. Let's start with Ionian. And what I'd like to do then is whatever that starting point is, I want it to count up in accordance to this sequence 1, 1.5, 2, 2.5, 3, 4, 4.5. I'd like to do that in a similar way as we did here so that it'll mathematically just copy across once I populate this first one. So there's a couple ways you might approach that. You might say, well, I want the next cell, I want you to find whatever number is here and then find the next one down in the sequence from there. That's one way. Or I could just try to do it mathematically, which I could try to do and say, well, can't I just count it up into the 12 units somehow? I can, except it doesn't work perfectly because I have 0.5 units, 1 plus 0.5 to 1.5 plus another 0.5 to 2 plus another 0.5 to 2.5 plus another 0.5 to 3. But then I have 3 to 4. There's no 0.5. And then I have that same situation when it goes from 7 back to 1 again. So really there's two situations where I can't just add a 0.5. That would be the easiest. The easiest thing would be just take this plus 0.5 and then I'm gonna make these two add a decimal and then just copy this across. Can't quite do that because there's two units where that's a problem. I said times 0.5, not times 0.5, plus 0.5, and then copy that across. So that's not gonna quite get me there because of those two issues. So what I'm gonna do is pull out those two issues specifically using a logic function. So I'm gonna say this is gonna be if tab, and then if I take this bit right here and then say if that plus 1, meaning when I go to plus 1, that's what I want only if I'm going from 3 to 4. That's basically it. If that plus 1 equals 4, then what do I want you to do? Then I want you to take that plus 1, right? So that's going to be the logic on that exception to the rule. And then I'm going to say, comma, if not, I'm going to embed another if, which is going to be if tab. And then I'm going to say, if that plus 1, this time it's going to be at that 7. Plus 1 would get to 8. I don't want it to be 8 though. I want it to go back to 1 around in a circle. So if that plus 1 equals 8, then, comma, what do I want it to do? I want it to return to me a 1, the Ionian. All right. So then, and then I'm going to say, comma, and then finally, if that's not the case, then what do I want it to do normally in all other cases? I want you to take that plus 0.5. So this one's a little bit backwards the way than I would usually like to build these, because usually I like to say if this is true, meaning this plus this is 0.5, do this, and if not, the exceptions. But it's a little bit easier to write the formula putting the exceptions first in this case. So here's the exception 1. If this plus this equals 4, then do that. Exception 2, if this plus this equals 8, then do that. And then for all other components, just take it plus 5. So I'm going to say, okay, and then it closes up the brackets. And then I'm going to grab that and pull it across, and I should have it move out properly, right? So there's 1, 1.5, that's going to be the Ionian Ocean. And then 2 is Dorian, 2.5 Dorian Ocean, 3 is Phrygian, and then it goes right to 4. Good, that's what we want. 4.5 is the Lydian Ocean, right? And then 5 is going to be Mixolydian, 5.5 Mixolydian Ocean, 6 is Aeolian, 6.5 Aeolian Ocean, and then it doesn't go to 8, it goes to 7. And so that, if I change this mode from a different starting point, we start on Dorian, then it still should be good. 2 to 2.5, 3, and then 3 to 4 is always a whole step. 4.5, 5, 6, 7, 6.5, 7, and then 1, 7 to 1, whole step, but goes around back to the start. So it looks like it's doing what we would expect there. So I think that's the engine. That's the key kind of logic function. So once I have that, then I could say, okay, now what I want to do is based on this node, because now I have the collection is at 4. If it's at 4 o'clock, here's the collection. So then I could base that 4 o'clock and pull the letter. So if this is 4 o'clock, then I can pull the appropriate letter in. So I could do that with an XLOOKUP function. So I could say that's the Ionian, that represents this column, and then I want you to compare to that this column. Not that one. I want you to this column that will be the letter. Okay, so it'll pull back a C. Now, if I change the collection to 5 o'clock, then what's going to happen? It's going to pull in the Ionian, which will be a C sharp D flat, right? If I go to 6 o'clock and so on, that's the engine. So I could say, okay, if this is at 4 o'clock, because we know that best, how could I do that? It's a classic XLOOKUP. So I'm going to say XLOOKUP tab. XLOOKUP down arrow. I want you to pull that one, find that lookup value, comma, within which array? In this array. So that's going to be G2 colon G13 F4, making it absolute. So now that's a whole absolute reference, and then comma, and then I want you to return the note letter, return this array, and then F4, because I'm going to copy that across, putting $signs before all 4 letters and numbers. And then we'll say enter. Now, I don't need to worry about the last bit of the argument, meaning if it's not found, what do? It always should be found. So if it's not found, it's going to do something funny. That's okay. That'll give us a check that there's something wrong. So that pulled out, gave us a C. Why? Because that's the Ionian, and that gave us a C. If I copy that across, then it should pull in the item above it, 2. There's the 2, and it gave us the relative D. So that looks like it's doing the correct thing. You have Ion in the collection of notes at 4 o'clock, collection of notes around the key of C. C is 1, D is 2, E is 3, F is 4, G is 5, A is 6, and B is 7, right? So then I could say, okay, well, what if I change the collection? So if I change it to 6 o'clock, and we're still looking at it from the perspective of the Ionian, now we're at 6 o'clock, which is the collection of notes around the key of D. There's the engine. 6 now pivoted this to a D, 6D, note D. This is the same. 1 is Ionian. So now we have D, collection notes around the key of D from the perspective of the Ionian. D, E is Dorian, is in E, and then Phrygian, nodal point 3, Phrygian is F sharp, G flat, and 4, nodal point 4, Lydian is G, and so on and so forth. So the notes are D, whole step to E, whole step to F sharp, half step to G, whole step to A, whole step to B, half step to C, whole step back to D. Okay, so what if I put this back to 4 o'clock and I change the mode, meaning I don't want to start at Dorian. I'm going to pivot around this point and say, what if I'm saying the modal center is Dorian? So now this didn't change. My engine didn't change. This is still 4 o'clock. But now I'm going to put the Dorian up top, which is kind of what a lot of people do when they're thinking like it's the 1. I'm not going to change it to the 1, but I'm going to put it at the front of the line so that I'm thinking of it as though that's kind of like the lowest note, because that's my tonic. So now I'm still at 4 o'clock because C over here is the Ionian, but I'm putting the Dorian first so that now you could think of it kind of like it's from a scale perspective. We're looking at the Dorian scale, D Dorian scale. I would rather name it. I think it's more appropriate to name it from the perspective of the Ionian, meaning 4 o'clock, collection of notes around the key of C, Dorian tonic. Dorian tonic. Why? Because then you don't have to memorize 12 times 7 different scales. You're just changing the modal center. Therefore, there's only 12 different collections, and then each of them has 7 modal centers. Okay. So that's basically the engine. So if I go back to the mode and make that one, this one up top here, now I could fix this. This isn't always going to be 1 through 12. It's going to be, I'm going to find that C, and I want to return, I want to find this C and return the related note number, which will be here. Now I might get a circle reference if I do it from here. Let's try it X. If I do X lookup, I want to find this C, comma, and this column, and then F4 collection, and then that makes it absolute, comma, and then return, find that C and return this column, and then F4, and I can close it up and enter. No, we're good. So that should be good. I can copy that across. Okay. So now we've got our notes in terms of numbers. We have our notes in terms of numbers. We have our notes in terms of letters. We have our relative positions in terms of numbers. You could actually add like the letters if we wanted to. So we could do an X lookup equals X lookup tab, find that one, comma, in this numbering system, F4, comma, and return the letter, and then F4, close it up, boom. So now we could have our letters in our table as well, because that might be easier than having two different numbering systems up top. All right, let's make this black and white. So I'm going to go Home tab, Font Group. We'll make it black, white. We'll center it. Okay, so that's going to be now that's going to be like my x-axis. On the y-axis, we're going to have our MIDI numbers, which I'll line up to later. So I'll take a look at that later. But for right now, that's going to be my data input, and I can make this whole thing like a grid, right? I can copy it down to like a grid format and just say that this is going to be possibly where we would do the data input. And if I imagined doing data input on a time by time stamp, now I could visualize what that data input would basically, look like from one input time stamp perspective. All right, so let me do the color system now. I'm going to grab these colors. I'm going to format paint this one, and I want to format paint the colors here. So now I'm looking at it. I'm looking at this from the perspective of which are in the collection and which are outside. I'll do the same with this one. Grab that color perspective and put it here. Okay. Now hold on a second, because now the ones that are outside are showing. So let's. That wasn't the best color scheme. I need to fix my color scheme for those ones. Dang it. Because I was going to have, so let's undo that. So these are the ones that are inside the collection, and these are the ones that are outside. Okay. And so then, so now you can imagine, basically, if I'm writing my music, you can imagine it being put in timestamp by timestamp, because now I can look at each particular timestamp from the perspective of basically, if I'm playing in the collection of notes of C and the Ionian, then I can visualize it this way and easily see the relative positions that are inside the collection and outside of the collection. If I'm playing in the collection of notes at 6 o'clock, now that rotates to a D. Now, maybe I like all the time looking at it from the perspective of the Ionian to Locrian, because that's my thing. That's how I visualize it. But maybe you would prefer to have the Dorian be up top if you're in a different mode. Meaning, if Dorian is my tonic, I might prefer it to be at the front. So I might say, look, I want this E to be at the front of my collection, and possibly if it was in a MIDI system, that might actually change the octave levels, right? Because if I move this, you would like the Dorian maybe to be the lowest note. So if I move this all over here, that could actually change the octave level if you got a little bit more complicated in it. But I'm not going to get into that in the weeds too much, right? But let's say we move that over. So now you have a Dorian. So now I'm looking at this at 6 o'clock, which is the collection of notes around the key of D, meaning here's the Ionian is on a D, but I want the Dorian to be the tonic. I want to visualize that as my lowest note. The numbers are all still the same, and they're color-coded. You can see what's inside and outside the collection. I'm not going to make the Dorian the 1 because that's going to confuse the crap out of everyone. But I could format it here to put it up at the front. So now I've got, the nodal point 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 1, rather than renumbering the system and then the nodal points. If you renumber the system, making that the 1 from a scale degree, then you don't know your nodal points. You don't know which one is you'd have to memorize 12 times 7 different relative positions as they line up to the to the Ionian Dorian, right? Whereas if you don't renumber the system, but you could realign the system, then all the numbers are all the same. So that's the basic engine that we could have, and this timestamp is looking at it by pivoting around the major component of the modal point, right? Changing the collection and then pivoting the modal point. All right. Now I could also do this in such a way that I might want to emphasize like the letter, which if I want to, like if I'm in the collection of notes, I could say here's the Ionian up top, and so any case that's going to be the major form that I can put. Now if I input this form, then is kind of like an instrument, because it's showing in a little bit more detailed way than on a standard MIDI roll, which only shows it all vertically. So you can visualize it possibly a little bit more in-depthly. For example, it's similar to like a piano or a guitar, which would have each chord in 1 unit of time. So if I go back on over here to the example, this is like showing each chord on 1 unit of time, which then would be mapped out vertically on a MIDI roll. So the benefit here is, like, if these 3 notes are mapped out over here, then I could change the perspective, and then rotate how I want to visualize those 3 notes that are being populated. That's going to be that's the general idea. And I'll show you this formula for pulling these notes in later, but in this example, I'm going from the MIDI roll, drilling down to this document. Right now, I'm kind of thinking of it as the reverse, as though we entered it over here, and as we do that, it will then populate to the MIDI roll. In a database program, you should be able to go either way, right? So in Excel, I have to kind of choose one. Am I going to do the MIDI roll, drill down over here, or am I going to do the input over here that will then pull into the MIDI roll? Okay. So that's going to be, so we'll build the MIDI roll component in a future presentation. This is going to be similar to the bit timestamp by timestamp data input, similar to a form, or possibly to like the general ledger, which would then be used to populate the trial balance.